It is snowing on Edo. It is the dead middle of a winter night, more than 300 years ago, and the great Shogun city is asleep under a soft, muffling white. The canals are black. The wooden houses are shuttered. And in one quiet district at the gate of a nobleman's mansion, a group of men are standing very still in the falling snow. There are a few dozen of them. They are dressed for war, but they are not an army. They have no lord, no banner, no domain, nothing left to lose. Their swords are drawn. One of them raises a wooden mallet, and with a single heavy blow begins to break down the gate. For nearly 2 years these men have been called drunks and cowards and worse. They have let the world believe they were broken. They have swallowed every insult in silence and waited for this one snowed-in night. Inside that mansion sleeps the man they have come for. By dawn he will be dead, and his head will be carried across the sleeping city to lie on a grave. And these men, every last one of them, will be dead within weeks by their own hands, ordered to die by the very government that half-worshipped them for what they did tonight. You have probably heard this story, or you have heard a story. The real one is quieter and colder and far more troubling than the version they usually sell you. My name is Aiden, and I am not Japanese. I need to say that right at the start because everything I am about to tell you, I tell you as an outsider who fell completely, hopelessly in love with a country that will never quite be his. I spent a few years living in Kyoto, in a tiny apartment with paper-thin walls, trying and failing to learn the language, and I have been trying to understand this place ever since. The story of the 47 Ronin is the one that first pulled me in, the Akko incident. The historians call it. And it is the one I have gotten wrong the most times, in the most ways. So tonight I want to walk you through what actually happened, as best as we can know it. And I want to be honest with you about where the true history ends and the beautiful legend begins, because the gap between those two things is the whole point. To understand why this story broke Japan's heart, you have to understand the strange, quiet moment it happened in. This is the year 1701, deep in what is called the Genroku era. Japan is nearly 100 years into the long peace of the Tokugawa shoguns, and this matters more than anything, so let me slow down on it. For centuries before this, Japan had torn itself apart in civil war, warlords, castle sieges, whole provinces changing hands on a single afternoon. The samurai were what that world was for. They were warriors, and they lived and died by the sword. But by 1701, that world is gone. There has been no real war in living memory, and so the samurai has become something strange, a warrior in a time with no war. He still wears the 2 swords that mark his rank. He still carries the whole heavy code of honor his grandfather died by. But his actual job most days is paperwork. He is an administrator, a clerk, a bureaucrat with a very sharp filing cabinet. The sword on his hip is mostly ceremony now. That is the pressure sitting quietly under everything I am about to tell you. A warrior class with all of its old fierce ideals about honor and loyalty and death, and absolutely nowhere to put them. It is like a loaded weapon that has been sitting in a drawer for 100 years. Everyone has half forgotten it is even loaded, and then one spring morning in the shogun's own castle, somebody pulls it out. The 2 men at the center of this are a study in opposites. The first is a young lord named Asano Naganori. He is the daimyo, the ruling lord of a small domain called Akko, out on the coast to the west. He is in his early 30s, earnest, a little hot-tempered, and by every account not especially worldly. In the spring of that year, he is handed a great honor and a great headache at the same time. He is chosen to help receive envoys sent by the emperor himself to the shogun's court at Edo Castle. This is the most delicate kind of assignment. Imperial protocol is a maze of 1,000 tiny rules. How to bow, where to stand, what color, what words, in what order, and getting even one of them wrong could shame not just Asano but his entire clan. And Asano does not know these rules. He needs a teacher. And here is the second man, Kira Yashinaka Kira Kazuk no Suke, to give him the title the old accounts use. Kira is the master of ceremonies, the high official whose whole expertise is exactly this court etiquette. He is older, polished, powerful, and it is his job to instruct Asano in how to carry the ceremony off. And something goes wrong between them. Something goes badly, poisonously wrong. Now, this is the first place I have to stop and be honest with you, because this is exactly where the legend takes over from the record. The popular story, the one everyone knows, says that Kira was greedy and cruel, that he expected lavish gifts, bribes really, in exchange for good instruction, that Asano, being honest and proud, refused to grovel and pay, and that Kira, insulted, took his revenge in 100 small humiliations, mocking Asano in front of the court, feeding him wrong instructions, needling him day after day until the younger man's patience finally snapped. It is a wonderful story. It gives us a clear villain and a wronged hero. But the truth is, we do not actually know why Asano did what he did next. The real, documented reason for the bad blood between these two men is lost. It may have been bribery. It may have been a personal insult. It may have been that Asano was simply unwell or breaking under a strain we cannot see across 3 centuries. The histories genuinely disagree, and the honest answer is that the cause is a mystery. Hold on to that, because a whole nation would soon build a monument on top of a motive nobody could actually name. What we do know is what happened on the 14th day of the 3rd month, the 21st of April, 1701, inside Edo Castle, in a hallway known as the Great Pine Corridor, the Matsu no Oroka, for the pine trees painted along its screens. Asano lost control. He drew the short sword at his side and he struck at Kira. He slashed him across the forehead and the shoulder. Other officials threw themselves in and pulled the 2 men apart before Asano could finish it. Kira was wounded, bleeding, but alive. And that failure, the fact that Asano did not kill him, is the hinge on which this entire tragedy turns, because you have to understand where he did it. To draw a blade in anger inside the shogun's own castle was one of the gravest crimes imaginable. The castle was sacred ground, the very heart of the peace that held all of Japan together. It did not matter what the provocation had been. It did not matter that Kira lived. Asano had shattered the peace in the one place it could never be shattered. The shogun at this time was Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi, a rigid, moralizing ruler, remembered by history partly for a set of eccentric laws protecting animals, especially dogs, which earned him the nickname the Dog Shogun. He was famously unbending about order and propriety, and when he heard that a provincial lord had drawn steel and shed blood in his castle, his judgment came down that same day, swift and absolute. Asano was condemned to die, and not in battle, but by seppuku, ritual suicide, the formal, unflinching death by which a samurai was permitted to answer for a grave failure and keep his honor. That very evening, in the garden of the house where he was being held, Asano knelt and carried out the sentence. He was around 35 years old. It is said he left a final poem, comparing himself to the spring blossoms scattered by the wind before they were ready to fall. His domain of Akko was confiscated. His family line was abolished. In a single day he lost his life, his lands, his house, and his name. And now here is the thing that lit the fuse. Here is the injustice at the center of everything. Kira was not punished, not at all. He was treated as the victim of an unprovoked attack, patched up and sent home. To us, maybe, that sounds one-sided but survivable. To a samurai of that era, it was a scream of wrongness. There was an old principle, deep in the warrior's sense of justice, called kenker ryōsibai, roughly, that when two men quarrel, both share the blame and both should pay. One man was dead, his family destroyed, his people scattered. The other man walked away without a scratch on his honor and a bandage on his head. The scales were not just tipped, they were smashed. And so, in a stroke, more than 300 samurai, the retainers who had served Lord Asano, who had sworn their lives to his house, became Ronin. That word gets thrown around loosely now, so let me tell you what it truly meant. A Ronin is a masterless samurai. The characters mean something like wave man, a man adrift, tossed on the water with no shore. And in this rigid, locked-down society that was close to a social death, a samurai's entire identity, his income, his rank, his purpose, his place in the world, all of it flowed from his lord. Take the lord away, dissolve the house, and these men were suddenly nothing. No stipend, no standing, skilled in a craft war that the peaceful world had no use for. Most of Asano's men did the sane, ordinary thing. They accepted the ruin, bowed their heads, and went off to build what quiet lives they could. Nobody could blame them, but a core of them could not let it rest. And at the head of that core was one man, the chief retainer of the Asano house, the senior official who had run the domain's affairs, Ōishi Kurenasuk. Or so I'm told. My Japanese friends would wince at my pronunciation. My old friend Kenji, who grew up not far from Akko, used to close his eyes in gentle pain every time I mangled these names. But Ōishi is the soul of this story. He was in his 40s, a steady, deliberate, unshowy man, an administrator, not a famous swordsman, and onto his shoulders now fell an almost impossible weight. The honor of his dead lord, the fury of his fellow retainers, and a decision that would cost him everything he had left. Because here is what Ōishi understood that the hotter heads around him did not. Revenge, killing Kira, was, in a strange way, the easy part. The hard part was surviving long enough to do it, and living with what it would cost. Kira knew perfectly well that Asano's men might come for him. He was a powerful, well-connected noble, and after the incident he was watchful and heavily guarded, with spies of his own keeping an eye on the scattered Ronin. If Ōishi and his men had come charging in during those first raw weeks, hot with grief, they would have been cut down at the gate, and the whole thing would have ended as a footnote, a failed, foolish attack by a handful of desperate men. So Ōishi chose the most painful path imaginable. He chose to wait, and more than that, he chose to disappear into a disguise so complete that it would consume his own good name. He moved to the Kyoto area, and he began, deliberately, to fall apart in public. He drank. He spent his days and nights in the pleasure quarters, among the tea houses and the entertainers, playing the part of a broken man drowning his disgrace in sake and company. He let himself be seen staggering in the streets. The story goes that he even divorced his own wife and sent her and the children away. Partly, it is said, to spare them from what was coming, and partly to complete the picture of a man who had abandoned all duty. I lived just a short walk from those old Kyoto pleasure districts, and I used to walk them at night, trying to imagine it. My landlady, a tiny, fierce woman who had lived in that neighborhood her whole life, once told me, with a kind of quiet approval, that the hardest courage is the kind nobody can see. And that was Ōishi's courage. Understand what it cost him. In a culture where a samurai's reputation was worth more than his life, This proud man deliberately made himself a laughingstock. There is a famous tale, and I will flag it honestly as one of the beloved legends, not something we can prove, that a samurai from another domain came upon Ōishi lying drunk in the street, recognized him, and spat on him in contempt, disgusted that Asano's chief retainer could sink so low instead of avenging his lord. Ōishi said nothing. He let the man believe it. He swallowed the insult whole, because it was working. Kira's spies watched this pathetic, dissolute has-been and reported back that there was nothing to fear from the Asano Ronin. Slowly, month by month, Kira relaxed his guard. He let some of his samurai go. He stopped watching the shadows, and all the while, patiently, invisibly, Ōishi was doing the real work, staying in secret contact with the loyal retainers, gathering intelligence on Kira's mansion, mapping the layout, the guard rotations, the way in. He was also quietly letting the numbers fall to the truth. Of the more than 300 men who had served Asano, most, understandably, drifted away as the months dragged on. Ōishi is said to have tested them, weeded out the uncertain, made sure that whoever remained was fully committed, because he knew that every single one of them was agreeing not just to kill, but to die. What began as hundreds narrowed in the end to a few dozen. And then, at last, the waiting was over. It was the 14th night of the 12th month. By the old Japanese calendar, that is a date every schoolchild in Japan still knows. By our Western calendar, it falls at the very end of January, in the year 1703. Nearly 2 years had passed since Asano knelt in that garden, and on that night, it was snowing. The Ronin gathered in secret and moved through the sleeping city to Kira's mansion in the Honjo district of Edo. There were, by the traditional count, 47 of them, and I will come back to that number, because it is not quite as simple as the legend makes it. They were armed and armored, and they had prepared with the cold precision of the administrators many of them were. They carried lists. They carried ladders and tools to breach the walls. They had even, the accounts say, sent word to the neighbors that they were loyal retainers carrying out a vendetta, and not robbers, so that the surrounding households would not panic or interfere. Even now, at the edge of violence, they were trying to observe a kind of terrible etiquette. They split into 2 groups, one to strike the front gate and one the rear so that Kira could not slip out in the confusion. Ōishi commanded. At the signal, a drum, in some tellings, they broke in. What followed was a real and desperate fight. Kira's guards, though caught by surprise, were many, and they defended their lord. In the snow and the dark and the lantern light, in the corridors and the garden of that great house, the Ronin fought their way inward. It was not the clean, choreographed thing of the movies. It was close and chaotic and brutal, and several of Kira's men were killed and many wounded. But the Ronin had surprise and numbers at the point of attack, and above all they had 2 years of held-back fury, and they broke the defense. And then, they could not find Kira. They searched the mansion room by room, and the man they had crossed 2 years of disgrace to reach was nowhere. His bed, when they found it, was still warm, so they knew he was close and hiding. They tore the place apart, and at last, in an outbuilding at the back, a storehouse for charcoal, the accounts say, they found a frightened old man in a white sleeping robe trying to conceal himself. He would not give his name, but when they looked, they found on his forehead and shoulder the scars of the wounds Lord Asano had given him in the Great Pine Corridor, almost 2 years before. That was how they knew. The scars identified him. It was Kira. And here is a detail that, to me, is the true heart of the whole story, the thing that separates these men from simple murderers, and the thing the loud versions of the tale so often rush past. They did not simply cut him down. Ōishi, the accounts tell us, treated Kira with the formal respect owed to his high rank. He knelt before the old man and explained who they were and why they had come. And then he offered Kira the chance to die the way a nobleman was permitted to by his own hand, in seppuku. Ōishi even offered him, it is said, the very same dagger with which Lord Asano had taken his own life. It was an offer of honor, a chance for Kira to end it with dignity. But Kira could not do it, whether from terror or age or simple refusal. He knelt there and did not move and did not answer. And so, when it was clear he would not act, Ōishi carried out the sentence himself. I will not dwell on it. You know what happened. The long wait was over. They put out the fires in the mansion so the snow-covered neighborhood would not burn. They gathered their dead and wounded. And then, as the winter dawn came up gray over Edo, these few dozen men formed a silent procession and walked all the way across the waking city, carrying with them Kira's head, wrapped and reverent, to a temple called Sengaku-ji, because that is where Lord Asano was buried, and at their master's grave they washed the head in a well that you can still see there today, and they laid it before his tomb. 2 years late, they had come to report to their lord that it was done, that the wrong had been answered, that his men had not forgotten. And I have stood at that spot. Sengaku-ji is a real place in Tokyo, and people still come every day and light sticks of incense until the whole grove is blue with the smoke of it, and I promise you it will quiet anything loud in your chest. And then the Ronin did the last thing anyone expected. They did not run. They did not scatter and melt back into the country. They surrendered themselves to the authorities calmly and waited to learn what would be done with them. And this is where the story stops being an adventure and becomes something much deeper, because it put the shogun's government into an impossible position, a genuine, agonizing knot that the simple versions of this tale always cut instead of untying. On one side, everything these men had done was, by the letter of the law, a crime. This was the Tokugawa peace. Private vendettas were forbidden. You did not gather an armed band and storm a nobleman's home in the shogun's city and kill him in the night, no matter how just your cause. The whole century of order rested on the state, and only the state, holding the power of life and death. By that measure, the 47 were murderers, and the law demanded they be executed as common criminals. But on the other side, they had done the most beautiful thing a samurai could do. They had embodied loyalty, the absolute devotion of a retainer to his lord, more perfectly than anyone had in 100 years of soft, peaceful, paper-shuffling life. They had given up everything, endured years of disgrace, and offered their own lives, all to answer a wrong done to a master who was already dead and could never reward them. They were, suddenly, the living proof that the old warrior soul was not dead after all, and the people of Edo adored them for it. Word spread, and the Ronin became overnight the most admired men in Japan. So the government was trapped between its own two deepest values. If it pardoned them, it was saying that loyalty stood above the law, that any samurai with a grievance could take up the sword, and the peace was only a suggestion. But if it executed them like criminals, it was punishing the very virtue the entire samurai order was supposedly built on. Scholars of the day argued it fiercely. One of the most respected thinkers of the era weighed in on how to hold both truths at once. There was no clean answer. Loyalty and law had collided head-on, and something had to give. The judgment they reached was, in its way, a small masterpiece of trying to honor both. The 46 Ronin who were held would be sentenced to death. The law would be upheld. The vendetta would not go unpunished, but they would not be executed like criminals. They would be permitted to die by seppuku, the honorable death, the samurai's death, the same end their lord had been given. It was a sentence and a salute at the same time. The state said, with one breath, "What you did cannot be allowed, and you must die for it," and "You did it as true samurai, and you may die as true samurai." And so, early in the year 1703, on the 4th day of the 2nd month, the Ronin carried out the sentence in the grounds of the noble houses where they had been held, and they met their end with the calm they had shown all along. Their bodies were taken to Sengaku-ji, to that same temple, and buried in a row beside the master they had avenged. Lord and retainers together again at last. Their graves are still there. Still, every single day, 300 years on, the incense burns. Now let me keep the promise I made you and come back to that famous number, 47. It is one of those numbers that has become almost sacred, the 47 Ronin, the 47 loyal retainers. But if you count carefully, 46 men committed seppuku that day. So where is the 47th? There was a man named Terasaka Kitchiman who took part in the raid but did not die with the others. What happened to him is, honestly, a little murky, and the accounts differ. The most common telling is that after the vendetta was complete, he was sent away by Ōishi as a messenger to carry the news back to Akko to the families. And so he was not among those taken and sentenced. He was, one way or another, spared, and he lived on for decades, an old survivor of the most famous night in samurai history. And when he finally died many years later, he too was buried at Sengaku-ji with his companions. So the graves, they're number 47. The men who died that spring day were 46. Both numbers are true, depending on exactly what you are counting. And the fact that we round it to a clean, heroic 47 tells you something about how legends prefer their edges smoothed. And that smoothing is really the last thing I want you to see clearly, because almost everything you picture when you picture this story, the wicked, sneering Kira, the pure and blameless Asano, the flawless, gleaming heroism of it all, most of that does not come from the historical record at all. It comes from the stage. A few decades after the events, the whole affair was turned into a play, a great puppet and kabuki epic that became one of the most beloved works in all of Japanese theater. And because the government did not permit dramatizing current political scandals directly, the playwrights changed the names and moved the story back into an earlier age. A thin disguise everyone saw straight through. That play is a masterpiece. It is also fiction. It sharpened the villains, deepened the romance, invented motives and speeches and whole characters, and gave the messy, ambiguous, sorrowful real events the clean moral shape a great drama needs. And that theatrical version is the one that flowed down the centuries into more plays and novels and films, including, a few years ago, a big Hollywood movie that reached for the same legend, and then piled on witches and shape-shifting monsters and a fantasy romance, until almost nothing of the actual history was left at all. I am not scolding any of that. Legends are how a culture keeps its heart warm. But the reason I wanted to tell you the quieter, truer version is that the real story is not less than the legend. It is so much more. Because strip away the monsters and the sneering villain and the perfect heroes, and what you are left with is not a simple tale of good triumphing over evil. What you are left with is a genuine, unsolvable collision between two things that a decent person is supposed to honor, and that, I think, is why it has never let go of me. These men were loyal. Completely, magnificently, terribly loyal. And their loyalty required them to break the law. And the law was not wicked. The law was the peace that had ended a century of slaughter and kept ordinary families safe. Both sides of that were good. Both sides were right, and there was no way to fully honor one without betraying the other. The Ronin chose loyalty and paid for it with their lives. The state chose the law and honored them even as it condemned them. Nobody in this story is the villain. That is what the movies cannot handle, and I don't think this is only some far-off samurai puzzle. I think it is one of the oldest, closest questions any of us ever face, just dressed in snow and steel. Because you have been here. In some smaller, quieter way, you have stood exactly where those men stood. There is a loyalty in your life to a person, a family, a friend, a promise, a memory, and then there are the rules. The law, the job, the sensible thing, what you are allowed to do, what it will cost. And once in a while, the two of them will not fit, and you will have to choose which one you can live with betraying. There was a monk I knew a little, during my years in Kyoto, an old man at a temple near where I lived. I asked him once what he made of the 47 Ronin, whether they had done right or wrong. He thought about it for a long time, the way he thought about everything, and then he said that I was asking the wrong question. He said the point of the story was never to give us the answer. The point was to make us feel, all the way down, how much it can cost to be a person of your word in a world that will not always let you be. So that is the question I want to leave with you, and I really do want your answer down in the comments, because I read them and I think about them. When loyalty and the rules have collided in your own life, when what you owed to someone you loved ran straight into what you were supposed to do, which one did you choose? And could you live with it? Tell me honestly. I would be grateful to know. My name is Aiden, and I am still just a foreigner who loves this country from the outside, getting the pronunciation wrong and learning as I go. If you want to keep learning it with me, these old, true, complicated stories from Japan's past, then come along, subscribe and stay a while. There is so much more of this world I want to show you. And the next time you see the 47 Ronin turned into a tale of clean and simple heroes, I hope you will remember the snow, and the 2 years of disgrace, and the scars that named a hiding old man, and a government that wept as it sentenced the men it most admired. The real story is quieter than the legend. It is also, I think, the most honest thing a country ever said to itself about the price of keeping faith. Thank you for sitting with me. Until next time.